Blind millionaire recovers his sight during his own wedding and falls on his knees when seeing his bride for the first time, realizing that she was. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. The grand ballroom of the historical Elysian Manor glittered like a starry dream. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow across the room, their light reflecting off towering ice sculptures and an intricately designed fountain at the center of the venue. Bouquets of white roses and orchids adorned every corner, their delicate fragrance mingling with the faint aroma of gourmet delicacies from the buffet tables. Guests, dressed in dazzling couture, mingled with glasses of champagne in hand, their laughter and conversation filling the space with a refined liveliness. This was no ordinary wedding. It was a union celebrated by the crème de la crème of society, a convergence of the elite. Film stars, business magnates, and politicians alike had gathered to witness the extraordinary event. Yet, despite the splendor and glamour, an air of poignant anticipation lingered. There was something deeply personal, almost sacred about this day. At the center of it all, the groom sat quietly. His custom-tailored tuxedo fit him like a glove, its black satin lapels sharp enough to match the severity of his handsome profile. He was poised as always, exuding the composed demeanor of a man accustomed to attention. But behind his darkened sunglasses, his fingers fidgeted subtly, betraying a nervousness not even his vast fortune could suppress. As whispers rippled among the guests about the bride's beauty and the groom's unique story, the groom himself was lost in thought. Though wealthy beyond imagination, the man who commanded boardrooms and built an empire was now overwhelmed by something entirely out of his control. His emotions. He gripped the polished cane resting by his side, its familiar surface grounding him. The contrast was stark. The opulence of his surroundings mirrored his life's successes, grand and awe-inspiring. Yet inside he wrestled with vulnerability. Today wasn't just a celebration of love. It was the culmination of a journey fraught with loss, resilience, and hope. It was the beginning of something he both yearned for and feared, something so precious it made him feel exposed in a way money and power never had. The soft chords of a violin floated through the room, signaling the bride's imminent arrival. The murmur of the crowd hushed, and the atmosphere grew thick with expectation. Little did anyone know, this day would not only unite two hearts but also change the groom's life forever, starting with what he was about to see. Sitting in the center of the room, the groom exuded an air of quiet authority, though his sightless eyes were hidden behind tinted glasses. Ethan Cole, a man whose name had become synonymous with success, wealth, and influence, had built his fortune from the ground up. His empire spanned continents, his charitable contributions were legendary, and his name regularly graced the covers of business magazines. But today none of that mattered. Today, Ethan was just a man, nervous, vulnerable, and on the precipice of an unknown future. He ran a hand over his impeccably tailored suit, a habit he'd picked up since losing his sight. His fingers traced the fabric's fine texture, grounding him in the present moment. He had chosen every detail of the day with painstaking care, guided by the voices and descriptions of those he trusted most. But there was one thing he couldn't visualize, her. The woman waiting to walk down the aisle was more than his fiancée. She was his light in the darkness, his compass when he'd been lost. Yet, Ethan couldn't shake the hollow ache that had lived inside him since the accident, the unrelenting uncertainty of what she truly looked like. He had built a mental picture of her from the stories she told and the touch of her hands, but in his most private moments, he wondered if his imagination had done her justice. It had been a long road to this day. Ethan could still feel the weight of his struggles, the frustration of losing control, the humiliation of relying on others after a lifetime of self-sufficiency. But through it all, she had been there. The woman he had fallen in love with had seen him at his weakest and never turned away. She loves you for who you are, not what you can see, his best man had said during their final moments of preparation. Those words echoed now, a steadying reminder as the first strains of the wedding march began. Ethan clenched his hands around his cane, his pulse quickening. A sudden thought seized him, unbidden but persistent. What if this day changes everything? What if seeing her, even if just once, reshapes their story? There was a reason Ethan had never sought out the surgeries or experimental treatments that could restore his sight. He feared what it might mean to see again, to confront the world, his mistakes, and himself in its entirety. But today was different. Today was her. And whether or not a miracle occurred, he knew he was ready. The soft strains of the wedding march swelled, cascading over the hushed guests. All eyes turned to the grand double doors at the far end of the room, where the bride would soon appear. Ethan's world was silent but alive with sensations. He couldn't see the admiring gazes or hear the whispers of awe that swept through the crowd. But he could feel the subtle shift in the air, the way the atmosphere seemed to vibrate with expectation. He leaned slightly toward his best man, his lips curving in a wry smile. Is it happening? Is she walking in? His friend chuckled softly, his voice warm. Not yet. They're building suspense for you, as if you're not already on edge. Ethan's fingers tightened on the cane resting across his lap. Though he tried to maintain his usual calm, his heart raced like a young boy's before his first dance. He had never experienced nerves like these in the boardroom or on the battlefield of corporate negotiations. But here today, his composure was unraveling thread by thread. I wish I could see her, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Even just a glimpse. I wonder if she'd match the picture I've built in my mind. You might be surprised, his best man replied cryptically. There was something in his tone, a note of mischief or perhaps awe, that made Ethan tilt his head in curiosity. As the music swirled around them, Ethan's mind wandered to the stories he'd heard of miracles. Love, people said, had the power to heal wounds, to restore broken souls. But could it truly transcend the physical? He brushed the thought away as foolishness. The doctors had been clear. His blindness was permanent. Science, not sentiment, governed such matters. And yet, strange things had been happening in recent weeks. Shadows had danced on the edge of his consciousness, fleeting and indistinct. Once, in the quiet solitude of his study, he thought he had glimpsed a faint glimmer of light through the darkness, like the ghost of a memory. But he hadn't told anyone, not even her. He feared raising false hopes or admitting his own. The first notes of the march reached their crescendo, and Ethan straightened in his chair. The guests shifted, their excitement palpable. Something about this moment felt different, charged, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would change his life forever. Ethan Cole hadn't always been blind, and he hadn't always known what it meant to truly live. Just 3 years ago, Ethan had been at the height of his power, a prodigy of the business world whose name commanded respect and envy in equal measure. His days were an endless carousel of boardroom meetings, high-stakes negotiations, and extravagant parties hosted in penthouses with views that could take your breath away. He owned luxury cars he barely had time to drive, private jets that took him to destinations he rarely appreciated, and properties so grand he sometimes forgot how many he owned. And yet, amid all the opulence, Ethan felt a hollowness that no acquisition could fill. He would return to his sprawling Manhattan penthouse at night and stare at the city lights, wondering why they didn't bring him joy. Somewhere between earning his first million and his first billion, life had become a numbers game, a relentless pursuit of more. But more had never turned into enough. His loneliness was self-imposed. Relationships, romantic or otherwise, were liabilities in his eyes, distractions that risked destabilizing his empire. The people he allowed into his orbit were carefully selected, most of them transactional companions who understood the boundaries he set. True intimacy was foreign to him, and he preferred it that way. Or so he thought. But one evening, long before his world went dark, Ethan had a fleeting encounter that lingered in his mind like an unfinished melody. It was at a charity gala, the kind Ethan attended more for publicity than philanthropy. He had been standing at the edge of the room, drink in hand, when a laugh caught his attention. Not the shallow, practiced laugh of socialites, but one so genuine it cut through the noise like a melody in a crowded room. He turned toward the sound and saw her. She wasn't dressed in designer couture like the others. Her gown was simple, understated, but it suited her perfectly. There was something about her, an elegance that didn't come from wealth, a lightness in the way she moved, as if she didn't belong to the heaviness of the world around them. Ethan had watched her, captivated, as she spoke to a group of children about the importance of kindness. They hadn't spoken that night. He'd been too busy being the man he thought he needed to be. But for months afterward, the memory of her haunted him, a quiet reminder that perhaps he had missed something, someone important. Little did he know, that fleeting moment had planted the seeds for a future he couldn't yet imagine. The day Ethan's world went dark was like any other, a carefully choreographed routine of meetings, deals, and high-powered decision-making. That morning, he'd closed a multimillion-dollar merger, the culmination of months of work. It was the kind of victory that should have left him elated. But as he slipped into the back seat of his luxury car, exhaustion weighed heavier than pride. "Home, Mr. Cole?" his driver asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "Oh, take me to the country house. I need air." The drive was long but soothing. The Manhattan skyline gave way to rolling hills and open roads, the kind Ethan rarely had time to appreciate. As the car navigated a winding mountain pass, Ethan finally allowed himself to relax. He leaned back, loosening his tie, and closed his eyes. He never saw the truck coming. Later, witnesses would describe the scene in horrifying detail. A semi-truck barreling through a red light, skidding on wet asphalt, its driver losing control as it veered into the opposite lane. Ethan's car had no chance. The collision was catastrophic, the sound of crumpling metal and shattering glass echoing through the quiet countryside. When Ethan woke in the hospital days later, the world was dark. At first, he thought it was the sedatives or the after-effects of the trauma. But as hours turned into days and the shadows didn't lift, a new reality began to sink in. The impact had caused irreparable damage to his optic nerves. The doctors spoke in measured tones, explaining the extent of his injuries and the slim chances of recovery. Ethan didn't hear most of it. All he could think was, this can't be happening. In the weeks that followed, his life unraveled. The independence he had prided himself on was gone. Simple tasks like dressing, eating, and navigating his own home became insurmountable challenges. His empire, once the center of his existence, became an afterthought as his board members scrambled to keep things afloat. Friends drifted away, unsure how to approach the man who had always been larger than life but was now confined to a chair in his darkened penthouse. But the worst part was the silence. Without the constant stimulation of sight, Ethan was left alone with his thoughts that turned inward, picking apart every decision, every missed opportunity, and every moment of his life that now seemed meaningless. For the first time, Ethan Cole felt truly lost. Ethan's life after the accident became a series of gray, monotonous days. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and charmed crowds now spent most of his time in silence, feeling the weight of isolation. He rarely ventured beyond his penthouse, and when he did, it was only because his caretaker insisted. Every attempt to restore a semblance of his old life felt like a hollow exercise. And then one day she arrived. He hadn't been expecting a new presence in his life. His assistant had mentioned hiring a volunteer from a local rehabilitation center to help him with errands and activities. "She's not a professional," his assistant had warned, "but she's incredibly kind and comes highly recommended." Ethan had almost refused, but something about his assistant's tone, hopeful, almost pleading, convinced him to agree. What did it matter anyway? No one could fix what was broken. The first time he heard her voice, he wasn't prepared for its effect. It was soft yet strong, imbued with a warmth that cut through the chill of his self-imposed isolation. "Mr. Cole," she said, her tone tentative but unafraid. "I'm Claire. It's nice to meet you." Ethan had grunted in reply, retreating further into himself. But Claire didn't leave. Over the days and weeks that followed, she kept coming back, undeterred by his curt responses and prickly demeanor. She spoke to him like he was a person, not a project, a distinction Ethan hadn't experienced in years. She didn't pity him, nor did she try to fix him. Instead, she brought him small comforts, describing the golden hue of the sunset, reading aloud from his favorite books, and helping him navigate his once familiar world with patience and humor. "What's the point?" he'd muttered one day when she encouraged him to learn to use a cane. "The point," she replied, her voice steady but kind, "is that you're still here. And as long as you're here, you deserve to live. Not just survive." It was the first time in months that Ethan felt something other than despair. Slowly, he began to look forward to her visits. She became the bright spot in his otherwise dark world, a reminder that there was still light, even if he couldn't see it. What Ethan didn't realize, what he couldn't yet know, was that Claire wasn't just a random volunteer. Their paths had crossed before years ago, in a fleeting moment that had meant more than either of them realized. Ethan's journey to adapt to blindness was neither linear nor graceful. In the early days, frustration often got the better of him. He hated asking for help, despised the vulnerability that came with being dependent on others. Tasks that had once seemed trivial, making coffee, signing documents, walking across a room, now felt like insurmountable obstacles. Claire, however, had a way of softening his sharp edges. She approached his struggles not with pity, but with practicality and humor. "Let's try it again," she said one morning as she handed him a braille book. "I promise, your fingers will catch on faster than you think." Ethan grimaced but followed her lead, running his hands over the raised dots. "Feels like I'm trying to read sandpaper," he muttered. Claire laughed, a sound that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Then consider it exfoliation for your soul." Her light-heartedness was a balm for his frustration. Slowly but surely, Ethan began to find his footing. Claire guided him through the basics of navigating his environment, labeling cabinets with textured markers, practicing using a cane, and trusting his other senses to compensate for his lack of sight. She celebrated his small victories with a sincerity that made him want to try harder. But progress wasn't without setbacks. There were days when Ethan's frustration boiled over, when the darkness around him felt suffocating. "This isn't a life," he snapped one evening after knocking over a glass of water. "It's just existing." Claire didn't flinch at his outburst. She knelt beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're right, it's hard. But you're still fighting, Ethan. And that's living." Her words lingered in his mind, a quiet challenge that kept him moving forward. One of the most pivotal moments came when she suggested they take a walk outside. Ethan resisted at first, afraid of the chaos of the city he could no longer see. But Claire promised she'd be by his side every step of the way. As they walked, she described the world around them in vivid detail. The honk of a cab, the chatter of a street vendor, the distant hum of a saxophone playing on a corner. Ethan found himself listening with a new intensity, piecing together a tapestry of sound and texture that felt more alive than anything he'd experienced since the accident. In those moments, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't over. It was simply different. Ethan didn't know exactly when it started happening, but somewhere along the way, his guarded heart began to soften. Maybe it was the way Claire always seemed to know when to push and when to step back, giving him room to find his strength. Or maybe it was the quiet resilience she carried herself with, as if she understood pain but refused to let it define her. Whatever it was, he found himself looking forward to her visits more than anything else in his day. One rainy afternoon, they sat together in his study, the sound of raindrops pattering against the window. Claire was reading to him, her voice steady and soothing, when she paused unexpectedly. "What is it?" Ethan asked, sensing her hesitation. She shifted in her chair. "This part always gets me," she admitted, clearing her throat. "It's where the character realizes he's been chasing the wrong things his whole life. That everything he thought he wanted wasn't what he needed at all." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued by the vulnerability in her voice. "And you? Do you feel like you're chasing the right things? Claire's laugh was soft but tinged with melancholy. I like to think I am. But I guess we're all a little lost sometimes. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You don't seem lost to me, he said quietly. You're steady, strong, like you know where you're going. The air between them shifted, the weight of his words hanging there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Claire smiled, though Ethan couldn't see it. I think we find strength in each other, she said. You've taught me that. From that day on, their conversations grew deeper, more personal. Claire began to share bits of her own life. Stories of her late father, who had taught her to see beauty in small things, and her struggles to find her purpose after his passing. Ethan, in turn, opened up about his fears, his regrets, and the life he'd built before it all came crashing down. Through these exchanges, Ethan's admiration for Claire grew. He began to see her not just as someone helping him navigate his blindness, but as a person whose kindness and resilience were extraordinary in their own right. He didn't need to see her face to recognize her beauty. It radiated in everything she said and did. And yet, as their bond deepened, a quiet yearning began to stir within him. A desire to truly know her in every sense, to see her, not just with his heart, but with his eyes. It was late one evening, long after Claire's usual visits ended. They had been discussing plans for Ethan to meet some of her friends at an upcoming event, an idea she had floated to nudge him further out of his isolation. But as they talked, their conversation wandered, first to books, then to childhood memories, and finally to dreams of the future. Claire's voice softened as she spoke of her father again, the way he had always encouraged her to live with an open heart. He used to tell me that life isn't about how much you accomplish, but how much you love, she said, her voice tinged with a wistfulness that tugged at Ethan's chest. For a moment he couldn't respond. Instead, he found himself tracing the lines of her words in his mind, imagining the contours of her expression. He sounds like a good man, Ethan said finally. I think he'd be proud of you. Claire let out a soft laugh. You don't know that. You can't even see me. I don't need to see you to know who you are, he replied without hesitation. You've shown me more than anyone else ever has. The air grew heavy with meaning, silence filling the space between them. Ethan could feel his heart beating faster, his palms slightly damp as they rested on the arm of his chair. For the first time in years, he felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, not of fear but of hope. Claire, he began, his voice rough with emotion. You've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I don't think I would have made it through this without you. She shifted in her seat, but she didn't speak. He could feel her eyes on him, the weight of her attention almost tangible. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now, he continued. But maybe there aren't any. Maybe it's just this. I think I'm falling in love with you. The confession hung in the air, raw and unguarded. For a moment, Ethan's world was completely silent, the anticipation almost unbearable. Then he heard her breath hitch, followed by the soft rustle of her moving closer. She reached out, her hand finding his. Ethan, she whispered, her voice trembling. I think I've been falling for you too. Her words unlocked something in him, a joy so profound it felt like sunlight piercing through his darkness. For the first time since the accident, Ethan felt whole. Ethan had always been a man of precision. In his professional life, he left no room for error, orchestrating deals and strategies with impeccable detail. But when it came to Claire, planning the perfect proposal felt overwhelming. How could he put into words what she meant to him, what she had brought into his life? How could he express the depth of gratitude and love that now defined him? He spent weeks thinking it through, often asking his assistant for advice. Eventually, inspiration struck. Simplicity, Claire's favorite quality. He wouldn't make it about grandeur or spectacle, but about the quiet, intimate moments that had shaped their love. The day arrived quietly, the crisp autumn air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. Ethan had asked Claire to join him for a walk in the park near his penthouse, a place she'd coaxed him to explore during his recovery. I thought you didn't like the cold, Claire teased as she linked her arm through his, guiding him along the gravel path. I don't, Ethan replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. But today's different. The path wound its way to a secluded spot by the riverbank, where a lone bench sat beneath the fiery canopy of a sugar maple. He had chosen this place deliberately, not for its beauty, though Claire had once described it as breathtaking, but because it was where she'd first convinced him to venture outside after the accident. It was here, with her hand on his, that he had begun to believe in living again. As they sat, Ethan's fingers brushed the small velvet box in his pocket. His pulse quickened, and for the first time in years he felt nervous. Claire, he began, his voice unusually hesitant. Can I tell you something? She turned to him, her warmth radiating through the chill of the evening. You can tell me anything. He took a deep breath. Before I met you, I thought my life was over. I thought losing my sight meant losing everything that mattered. But you showed me that there's so much more. You gave me hope when I didn't have any. Claire's breath caught as he pulled the box from his pocket, his fingers fumbling slightly as he opened it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. I know I can't see your face, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, but I've seen your heart, and it's the most beautiful thing in the world. Will you marry me? Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she whispered, yes. 1,000 times yes. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of activity, yet the process was a reflection of Ethan and Claire's unique dynamic. Ethan, true to his personality, approached the preparations with the precision of a CEO. He delegated tasks to a team of event planners, ensuring every detail met the highest standard. Claire, however, had a simpler vision. I don't need fireworks or an orchestra, she said one afternoon as they sat reviewing options for the venue. I just wanted to feel genuine. Ethan tilted his head, a small smile playing on his lips. You realize us is a billionaire and a woman who thinks mason jars are fancy, right? Claire laughed, swatting his arm lightly. Exactly. Balance. Her perspective both challenged and amused him. She pushed back against extravagance with the same quiet strength she brought to every other part of their relationship. When the planner suggested towering floral arrangements and a 7-tier cake, she countered with wildflower centerpieces and a modest dessert table. When Ethan proposed hiring a famous designer for her gown, she chose a local boutique instead. It's not about the money, she explained one evening when he expressed his desire to give her the world. It's about meaning. The things that matter aren't always the most expensive, they're the most heartfelt. Though he didn't say it aloud, Ethan admired her all the more for it. For years, his life had been defined by grandeur and excess, yet Claire reminded him that simplicity often held the greatest beauty. As the wedding day approached, Ethan found himself growing nervous, not about the ceremony itself, but about the significance of the commitment they were making. He couldn't shake the quiet fear that his blindness might someday become a burden too heavy for Claire to bear. Though she had never wavered in her love for him, a small part of him still wondered if she deserved someone who could give her everything, including the ability to look into his eyes. And yet there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when he felt a flicker of hope. Twice now, in the quiet of his room, he'd thought he saw faint flashes of light, like the whisper of something stirring in the darkness. He hadn't told Claire, not wanting to raise false hopes, but the possibility lingered in the back of his mind like an unanswered question. As their big day drew near, Ethan found himself wishing, not for his own sake but for hers, that he could see her, even if just once. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with a kind of golden light that felt like a blessing. Ethan couldn't see the sunrise spilling over the horizon, but he could feel its warmth through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. The quiet hum of the city below seemed to carry a different energy today. Electric, expectant, as though the universe itself knew this was no ordinary day. Ethan stood in front of the mirror as his best man, Daniel, adjusted the tie on his custom tuxedo. Though he couldn't see his reflection, Ethan's fingers traced the lapels of the jacket, his touch discerning every careful detail. You clean up well, Daniel joked, stepping back to admire his work. Claire's going to cry when she sees you. Ethan smiled faintly but didn't reply. His thoughts were elsewhere. On Claire, of course, but also on the strange feelings that had been stirring inside him. Over the past few days, he'd noticed subtle changes. Moments when the darkness surrounding him didn't feel so absolute, when shapes and movements seemed to flicker at the edges of his awareness. He hadn't told anyone, not even Daniel, unsure whether these moments were real or the wishful imaginings of a man yearning for the impossible. "Ready?" Daniel asked, clapping him on the shoulder. Ethan exhaled slowly. "As ready as I'll ever be." The drive to the venue was quiet, Ethan's thoughts a tangle of nerves and anticipation. He couldn't stop picturing Claire walking down the aisle, her voice steady as she exchanged vows with him. Would she cry, or would she laugh that bright, melodic laugh he loved so much? He imagined the soft rustle of her gown, the faint floral scent that always clung to her skin. But most of all, he wondered what it would be like to see her. He'd lived with her image in his mind for so long. Her smile pieced together from descriptions, her eyes imagined in quiet moments. What if, by some miracle, he could look upon her for the first time today? When they arrived at the venue, Ethan stepped out of the car and was met by the faint strains of music drifting from inside. Guests were already gathered, their excitement palpable. Daniel guided him toward the entrance, but Ethan paused before stepping inside, tilting his head slightly as a strange sensation washed over him. A warmth, a lightness that felt like hope. "Let's go," Ethan said, gripping his cane tightly. Whatever happened today, he was ready. The grand ballroom of the Elysian Manor was bathed in golden light, the late afternoon sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. The soft hum of anticipation buzzed among the guests as they took their seats, their whispers falling to a hush as the music shifted. The ceremony was about to begin. Ethan stood at the altar, gripping his cane with one hand while the other rested at his side. He felt the comforting presence of his best man nearby and the faint heat of the gathered crowd. Though he couldn't see the space, he could sense its grandeur. The faint echo of footsteps on polished marble, the rustle of silk gowns and tailored suits. The room smelled faintly of lilies, Claire's favorite flower, their scent weaving through the air like a promise. The first notes of Claire's chosen song filled the room, and Ethan's chest tightened. This was it. He stood straighter, his heart pounding as the double doors at the far end of the aisle creaked open. He couldn't see her, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The collective intake of breath from the crowd, the way the music swelled to greet her. He focused on the sound of her footsteps, slow, deliberate, each one bringing her closer to him. He had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was almost too much to bear. "She's breathtaking," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan swallowed hard, his hand tightening around his cane. He tried to picture her as she approached, the gown she had described to him, simple yet elegant, the way she said she wanted to feel like herself, not a stranger in lace. He imagined her hair cascading in soft waves, her smile radiant. And then something strange happened. At first it was just a flicker, a faint glow at the edges of his vision. He blinked, his heart racing. Was it the light from the chandeliers? The sun reflecting off a crystal? But no, it was growing stronger, the darkness beginning to lift like a fog burned away by dawn. Colors swirled, soft and indistinct, then sharpened. Blurs turned to shapes, shapes into clarity. His breath caught as the room came into focus. The towering flowers, the glittering chandelier, the rows of guests, but all of it faded as his eyes found her. Claire. She moved toward him like a vision, her every step graceful and sure. Her gown shimmered in the light, but it was her face that undid him. She was everything he had imagined and more. Her beauty transcendent, her eyes filled with love. Ethan's cane clattered to the ground as his knees buckled. He fell, overcome, his hands trembling as he pressed them to his face. The room erupted in gasps, but all he could see, all he could feel was her. Time seemed to freeze as Ethan knelt there, his hands trembling against his face, his chest heaving with emotion. The impossible had happened. His sight had returned. After years of darkness, the world around him was alive with color and light. But none of it mattered. Not the grandeur of the room, not the awestruck expressions of the guests. All he could see was Claire. She paused mid-step, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears as she took in the scene before her. Her hands clutched her bouquet tightly, her knuckles turning white as if she feared letting go would shatter the fragile miracle unfolding before them. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice soft and disbelieving. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. How could he begin to describe what he was feeling? How could he put into words the overwhelming beauty of the woman before him, the woman who had been his anchor, his hope, his everything? His mind scrambled to catch up, trying to reconcile the image of her with the one he had pieced together from memory and imagination. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, creating a halo effect that made her seem almost ethereal. Her eyes, a rich, expressive green, shimmered with love and disbelief. And her smile. It was a thing of pure magic, a warmth that radiated from her and wrapped around him like a soft embrace. Ethan's hands fell to his lap as tears streamed down his face. "It's you," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. You're more beautiful than I ever imagined." Claire's bouquet slipped from her hands as she rushed to him, her gown sweeping across the aisle. She fell to her knees before him, cupping his face in her hands. "You can see?" she asked, her voice trembling with both hope and disbelief. "I can see you," Ethan said, his own hands reaching up to cover hers. "Claire, I can see you." Around them, the guests were frozen in stunned silence, some wiping tears from their eyes, others whispering in awe. But for Ethan and Claire, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. It was as if they were the only ones in the room, the only ones who mattered. And then, as he gazed into her eyes, the memory struck him, a moment from years ago, fleeting but unforgettable. She had been the woman at the charity gala, the one who had laughed so freely, who had captivated him with her grace and warmth. She had been there before the darkness, a glimpse of light he hadn't realized he needed until now. "It was you," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "It's always been you." The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air, wrapping around Claire like a warm, trembling embrace. Her breath caught as she stared into his eyes that now brimmed with emotion, reflecting her own. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, though her heart already knew the answer. Ethan's trembling hand reached up, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered, reverent, as if confirming that this moment was real. "That night," he began, his voice breaking, "at the charity gala. You were there. You were laughing with the children, telling them stories about kindness and hope. I couldn't stop watching you. I didn't even speak to you, but you stayed with me." Claire's lips parted in astonishment, her memory rushing back to the very night he spoke of. She remembered seeing him, the magnetic figure standing on the fringes of the crowd, exuding power yet cloaked in solitude. At the time, she had felt an inexplicable pull toward him, but she had dismissed it as a fleeting moment in an otherwise ordinary evening. Now, it felt like fate had been working quietly, stitching their paths together long before they understood why. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought you were untouchable. Someone so far removed from my world." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she smiled through it. "But now here you are." Ethan let out a shaky laugh, his forehead resting against hers. "I thought you were untouchable too. But you've always been right here, haven't you? Even when I couldn't see you." The guests, who had been watching in stunned silence, erupted into soft applause and murmurs of disbelief. The officiant, who had been frozen at the altar, stepped forward with a bemused smile. "Well," he said lightly, "I think we've all witnessed something extraordinary today. Shall we proceed?" Ethan and Claire laughed through their tears, the spell of the moment breaking just enough for them to rise. Claire helped Ethan to his feet, though his grip on her hand suggested he wasn't letting go anytime soon. As they stood before the altar, the enormity of what had just happened began to settle over them. The miracle wasn't just Ethan's sight returning. It was the realization that their journey, one of loss, love, and resilience, had been guided by something far greater than coincidence. They had found each other not once, but twice, and neither of them would ever let go again. As the applause from the guests died down, the officiant adjusted his glasses and smiled warmly at Ethan and Claire. "This day was already special," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "but it seems we've been witness to something truly extraordinary." Ethan tightened his grip on Claire's hand, his fingers lacing with hers as he stood taller, steadier. For the first time since his accident, the darkness that had consumed him felt like a distant memory. Now, all he could see was the woman standing beside him, the woman who had carried him through his darkest moments and helped him rediscover hope. The ceremony resumed, but every word of the officiant's speech carried new weight, infused with the miracle that had just unfolded. When it was time for the vows, Claire went first. Her voice was clear and steady, though tears shone in her eyes. "Ethan," she began, her gaze never leaving his, "when I met you, I saw a man who had lost everything he thought he needed to survive. But what you didn't see was that your heart, the heart that gives so much, that loves so deeply, was still whole. You taught me what it means to believe in someone, to trust them completely. And today, I promise to spend the rest of my life believing in you, just as you've believed in me." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he held her gaze. He could see every detail now, the faint freckles on her cheeks, the curve of her lips as she smiled. She was more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. When it was his turn, he took a deep breath, his voice rough with emotion. "Claire, you've shown me what love really means. When I lost my sight, I thought I'd lost everything that made me who I was. But you proved me wrong. You didn't just guide me through the darkness. You became my light. You taught me to live again, to hope again. And now, standing here seeing you, I know you've always been my greatest gift. I promise to honor you, to cherish you, and to love you with everything I am, for as long as I live." The crowd erupted into cheers as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Ethan didn't wait for permission to kiss her, pulling Claire into his arms as their lips met. The room blurred, the sound of applause and laughter fading into the background. All that mattered was her. His wife, his miracle. The reception was everything Claire had dreamed of, joyful, intimate, and full of warmth. The room buzzed with laughter and heartfelt toasts as guests celebrated the miraculous union of two souls who had endured so much to find each other. Ethan and Claire danced together for the first time as husband and wife, his hands steady on her waist, her smile radiant as they swayed to the gentle melody of a piano. But it wasn't until the festivities began to wind down that the weight of the day truly settled on them. The two slipped away from the crowd, leaving the glowing ballroom behind for the cool, quiet embrace of the garden outside. String lights hung from the trees, casting a soft glow over the manicured lawn. The crisp night air smelled faintly of jasmine, and the distant hum of crickets filled the space between them. Ethan held Claire's hand tightly as they walked, his steps measured but sure. It felt strange to see the world again, to notice the little things he had forgotten, the shimmer of moonlight on leaves, the way the stars scattered across the sky. But even as he marveled at it all, his gaze kept returning to Claire. She glanced at him, catching his quiet smile. "What is it?" she asked softly, her fingers brushing against his. Ethan stopped, turning to face her. I don't think I'll ever stop looking at you," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I've spent years imagining what you might look like, but now, it's more than I ever dreamed. You're more than I ever dreamed." Claire laughed softly, her cheeks flushing. "You don't have to flatter me, you know. You've already got me for life." "I'm not flattering you," Ethan said, stepping closer. His voice grew quieter, more serious. "Today wasn't just about getting my sight back. It was about seeing everything differently. About realizing how much I've missed, not just with my eyes, but with my heart." Her expression softened, her eyes glistening as she wrapped her arms around him. "I think we both learned a lot about what really matters," she said. And I wouldn't change a thing. Not the hard parts, not the pain, because it brought us here. Ethan kissed her gently, his heart full. For the first time in years he felt whole, not because of the miracle of his sight, but because of the love that had brought him back to life. The days following the wedding were filled with a sense of awe, not just for Ethan and Claire, but for everyone who had witnessed the extraordinary event. News of Ethan's sight returning spread quickly among the guests, and soon the story began to ripple out to friends, family, and even the media. But for Ethan and Claire, the miracle wasn't about the headlines. It was about the profound change it had brought to their lives. A week after the ceremony, Ethan and Claire sat in the office of his longtime neurologist, Dr. Albright. The doctor, a pragmatic man who rarely showed emotion, was visibly moved as he reviewed Ethan's scans and listened to his recounting of the wedding day. "It's remarkable," Dr. Albright said, leaning back in his chair. "There's no medical explanation that fully accounts for what's happened. The trauma to your optic nerves was considered irreversible. Yet here you are." Claire, sitting beside Ethan, squeezed his hand. "So what could have caused it?" she asked. "Stress. Relief. Something emotional." Dr. Albright smiled faintly. "It's possible that the wedding, the heightened emotions, the flood of hormones, the environment, triggered some sort of neuroplastic response. The brain is an incredible organ, and it's not unheard of for patients to recover abilities we thought were lost. But this is exceedingly rare." Ethan listened quietly, his gaze fixed on the doctor. "So you're saying it was a fluke?" "Not a fluke," Dr. Albright corrected. "A miracle if you believe in those. Science can explain a lot, Ethan, but it can't explain everything." As they left the office, Ethan turned to Claire. "Do you think it was science?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "Or something more?" Claire looked up at him, her green eyes bright with conviction. "I think it was love," she said simply. "The kind of love that heals in ways we can't always understand." Ethan stopped walking, pulling her into his arms. "I think you're right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because when I look at you, Claire, I don't just see you. I see everything you've given me. You taught me how to live again, how to love. That's the real miracle." Claire smiled, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Then let's keep believing in it. In love, in miracles, in us." As they held each other beneath the fading light of the afternoon sun, their journey felt complete, not because their struggles had ended, but because they had found meaning and joy in every moment. Somewhere in the distance, the faint chime of church bells echoed, as if the universe itself was celebrating the love that had transformed them both forever. As Ethan and Claire stepped out of the doctor's office into the brisk afternoon air, they paused for a moment to take in the world around them. For Ethan, everything was still new, a vibrant, colorful tapestry of sights he was rediscovering. But as beautiful as the world seemed, nothing compared to the woman standing by his side. He turned to her, taking her hands in his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I used to think fate was something people invented to make sense of chaos. But now, looking at you, I realize it's real. It's what brought us together." Claire smiled, brushing her thumb over his knuckles. "Fate might have started it," she said, "but love is what carried us through." They walked home together, taking their time. Claire pointed out little things along the way. A bird nesting in the branches of a sycamore, the way the light reflected off the windows of a nearby cafe. Ethan listened, his heart full, but he didn't need her words to see the world. For once, he could see it all clearly. The shimmering leaves, the cobblestone streets, the sparkle in her eyes when she looked at him. Later that evening, as they sat together on their couch, Ethan pulled her close. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of city life filtering through the windows. "Do you remember what you said to me the day you taught me to use a cane?" he asked, his voice soft. Claire tilted her head, her brows knitting in thought. "I think I said you deserve to live, not just survive." Ethan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "That's what you've given me, Claire. A life worth living. You didn't just help me through the darkness. You became the light. And I don't know if I can ever repay you for that." "You already have," Claire whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. By letting me love you. By loving me back. As they sat there, the weight of their journey settled over them, not as a burden, but as a reminder of how far they had come. Ethan realized that his blindness had been a gift in its own way. It had stripped him of the superficial and forced him to see what truly mattered. Connection, kindness, and a love that had reshaped his world. For the rest of their lives, Ethan and Claire carried that love like a flame, a guiding light that burned brighter than any darkness they had ever faced. And in every moment they remained grateful, not just for the miracle of sight, but for the miracle of finding each other. Because sometimes fate doesn't just guide us, it transforms us.